Perfect. Welcome to this second to last workshop in our spring workshop series for volunteer science. The focus this spring has been sort of the basics of doing online behavioral research. So we've done a workshop on recruiting online participants, designing your first online experiment. Today we're going to talk about linking survey and behavioral data. So how do you take the stuff we've been doing for the past forever and look into some of the new kinds of behavioral data that we can get while we're online, but also more traditional sources of behavioral data, whether it's administrative data or data from our lives in the real world. I want to let you know that we have one workshop coming up in a month that'll be focused on incentivizing online participants, and we'll talk about monetary incentives, but we'll also talk about non-monetary incentives and gamification. Just again, I think the theme of these workshops is a mile wide and an inch deep, and the idea here is we want to give you a broad survey of a topic. So then where you want to go, where exactly in this area you want to take it, where you want to go that mile deep. So without further ado, and I have a link for the next workshop at the end here on the slides. Just to give you sort of the outline of where we're going, I'm just going to start talking about why do we want to link survey and behavioral data? What are the advantages of doing both? How do we actually measure behavior? And this is sort of creating useful buckets for you to think about. How do you get this behavioral data and how do you measure it? And then I'll talk about each of the three buckets. So how do we collect this past behavioral data from behavior that we've already done? How do we collect instrumented behavioral data? So creating activities that people do that we gather data from. And lastly, how do we collect field behavior data? So data that's being created or about the things that we're doing while we're not in the lab, while we're sort of out in our day-to-day lives. So this is going to be our first pause. Oh, and my little timer thing doesn't work. I was going to give you, I have a little timer here that's going to give everybody 30 seconds. What I want you to do is just put in chat 2 theoretical constructs that you study. So, if you're studying, gender inequality and wages, you say gender and wages. Or you study COVID and mood. Just what are the 2 constructs that you study? I'm going to come back to these, so keep them in mind. These are the sort of the things that, if you're thinking of doing behavioral work, these are the things that you think you're going to try and measure with surveys and with behavioral measures. Oh, good. This is wonderfully diverse. And I should, since I don't have the timer on the screen, I'll have to feel it out. I'll do a 10-second countdown. 1 to 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. All right, thank you. You'll have other chances to put stuff in the chat as well. We're going to build on this list. So keep the things in mind that you put in before. The whole point of this is to get you thinking about your research and how this connects to your research. So let's talk about why we would want to link surveys and behavioral data. There's our mouse here. There we go. One of the most important things when we think about what surveys measure and what we can measure in behavior is whether we're measuring the right thing. So when we ask somebody on a survey, are you politically liberal, conservative, or moderate? It's an identification question. Do you identify as liberal? Do you identify as conservative? Do you identify as a moderate? Versus when we ask people, or when we look into people's behavior, we say, what do they say? Who do they vote for? Who do they give donations to a particular party or particular political organizations? These are different ways of getting at an underlying construct of political partisanship or political identity. So we can measure the same thing in different ways, or we can measure different things using different methods. And the idea here is, if we're using behavioral measures, we're thinking a little bit differently about the kind of construct that we're creating. The next utility of using surveys and behavioral data is external validity. So on the left, we have the big 5 personality inventory. And the question is, do people who score high on openness actually go out and experience more things? Are people who I think they're open or self-report openness actually going out and being open, doing the things that we expect open people to do. So this helps ground our research in real world behavior, thinking about, does what people say on surveys match what they actually do in the real world? Reliability. So we ask things that are important on surveys, and then we want to know, how well does this map on to behavior in the real world? And it's not just a construct question, but like, how often does this actually map onto the real world? So on the left-hand side, I have an actual survey that we did on housework and divvying up housework. So who does the actual work of buying groceries? And that's just a survey question. I do it all, my partner does it all, we split it. When we ask this as a survey, it's really difficult for us to get a precise measure of who does it and how often. So we have to do these aggregate buckets. When we do this behaviorally, we look at who actually, if we ping somebody with a text message that says, "Hey, did you go grocery shopping?" and who did it, that gives us a more externally valid measure of the behavior. But then we can go back and map on to and say back onto the survey and say, when somebody says, "I did it for both of us," that usually means that they did it 90 to 95% of the time, usually. The last thing is calibration, or another reason is calibration. On the left-hand side, we have questions from the narcissism inventory. And on the right-hand side, we have this prisoner's dilemma. Right. So the question is, how narcissistic do you have to be to, dominate with a betray response or a cooperative response? What's the sort of scale relationship? It's a great point about this being a double-barreled question. This is part of scale development. We turned it into examples. So who does the physical work, for example, buying groceries and cooking? So calibration. What we're looking at here is, somebody says, I do more of this, less of this on a survey, and then we want to see, at what point does more or less correspond to more or less of some real world behavior. So I want to take a pause and just ask you, there it is. There, the timer. What are some of the behaviors that exemplify the constructs that you are researching? What are some real world behaviors that exemplify a disability that you're studying, or conflict, political tolerance? Hiring, actually preparing an emergency kit, discussions that people have, actual activity a week. Yep. Good. Why is my oh, weird, the animation pause when I switched over to the chat to look at the chat. So I lost. Oh, that's so weird. Okay. All right. Well, this is the first and last time we'll do this animation thing, because I can't keep track of chat. All right. Well, thank you all. Like I say, my hope is that prompting you to think about these behavioral measures will help advance your research and thinking about how do you take your surveys offline, or how do you combine your survey research and your behavioral research. So now that we've talked about why you would want to measure things behaviorally, what do we get out of it? The question is, how do we go about measuring behavior? There are a lot of ways to sort of bucket up behavior. The way that I want to define it here is simply as actions that people take. Um, I will disclose that there are a lot of survey researchers here, and there is a whole approach to surveys that treats surveys as a behavior, which I think is a completely valid and a good way of looking at surveys. At what point do people, um, by making a selection about what political ideology you follow, you're making an identification. It's an active identification. I identify as a moderate. But generally, what we want to think about here is beyond just what do you choose on a survey. What are you actually doing? And physically, what are you saying? Where are you going? A broader definition of action or behavior. Let me close the thing here. So how do we actually measure these actions that people are taking? Well, the first thing we have is past behavior, the data that people actually, what data on what people actually did in the past. So traditionally we have administrative data. So for those in political science, this is voter data. Who did you actually vote for? And getting that from states. These state voter rolls and state election results, for example. You can also get this from social media. What did you post yesterday? You can also get this from self-reports. Right. So, were you the one who went grocery shopping last week? Surveys are a way of getting at past behavior. Yeah. A second kind of behavior is instrumented behavior. So data that behavior actions that we elicit ourselves. So we ask people to make decisions. We give people a stimuli and we get them to respond to that stimuli, and we measure that response, whether it's the choice, how long it took, the content of the response itself. We give them tasks to do. So we ask them to solve a puzzle or go grocery shopping, and look at what did they buy, how well did they solve that puzzle. The type of measurement of people's action is stuff. Collecting data from the field. So these could be field observations. We can ask people to take a picture of where they are, write down what they see, write down what they currently feel. And the other one is ecological measurements. So measuring, taking a measurement of where people are at a given time. What differentiates this from past behavior is that you're creating behavior as it's happening, as opposed to collecting data on actions that have happened in the past. So we're collecting data in the moment from the field. So where do we get these kinds of behavioral data? Past behavior we get from social media, the mobile phone data, your location history, your SMS messages, app usage, location data. So Google, if you have a Google account, will keep, and you have an Android phone, keeps track of all your locations. Oh, how is this? Sorry, Kate, you're drawing on my screen, which I didn't realize you could do. That is odd. See, there we go. I disabled annotation, which I didn't realize you could do. So hopefully that should be fixed. You should be able to annotate locally, but not for everybody. Location data, you can get location data from Google. Shopping data, you can get somebody to send you their credit card receipts if you really wanted to, or bank statements if you really wanted to. Lots of things. Why is this all weird? Instrument of behavior. So you can create tasks. I don't know how to delete the annotation. We'll have to suffer with it. So you create the tasks, you create the instruments, problem-solving tasks, you create a vignette, you create a fake campaign flyer, you simulate your own content. The last thing is this field behavior, and again, I don't know why this is all separate. You can do things like ecological momentary assessments, where you send a note to somebody and say, hey, how's it going? Ask people to keep a journal or a diary of what they've been doing, or these context-aware measures, which I'll get into in a second. Oh no, this is not good. If I can erase, here we go. Take all the annotations off here. All right, ta-da. All right. So thinking of the behaviors that exemplify your concepts, how would you go about measuring that behavior? Would you do a survey while they're doing it? Would you create a task that will simulate that behavior or somehow captures that behavior in the lab? Would you go and collect administrative data? What kind of administrative data could you collect? So I'm going to give us 30 seconds to put that in the chat. How would you actually collect data on that behavior? Vignette tasks. Yeah. Vignettes are so powerful because you can just create any kind of synthetic world you want with as much or as little information as you want. Yep. Yeah. I see a lot of people talking about self-reports, which of course is a survey, but at the same time, one of the things that I'm going to focus on in this sort of third leg here, talking about field observations, is that we can get surveys really close to the behaviors themselves and make them more trustworthy. Get over some issues with memory, for example. Google News results, yeah. Great, okay, wonderful. All right, so here we go. So how do we actually get that data into our study? We've thought about what is the behavior we want to measure, where does that data exist, how do we get it into our study? So past data, how do we get access to past data? So this is inflected towards online data, but it's not necessarily relying on online data. So very commonly, people use public APIs to get, what's your Twitter name, what's your Reddit screen name, what's your Tumblr screen name. I know, how do we take the stuff that you do in public and link you to that? Theoretically, you can do the same thing with voter files. If you have voter data, you can ask somebody for their name and address and match them to the voter file. The way that this usually works is we just ask them that question. What's your name? Give us the information that you need for us to connect you to your data that's publicly available. One of the challenges with doing it this way is that people misspell things, especially their usernames, or people who don't actually want to give you the data, but will give you a false name or false information. The way that we typically handle this on Volunteer Science is we use apps from these platforms to have people sign in. So like you sign into Twitter and that's how we get your Twitter username. That way there's no misspellings, no claiming accounts that don't belong to you, that kind of thing. Same thing for Reddit and Tumblr and the others. But there are ways of making it a little bit more reliable to gather this data. A second thing that you can do is getting API. So basically you build your own app for these platforms, and then have the user authorize access to the data. There are some different platforms that have different rules. Most of the platforms where you collect this kind of data are social media platforms. Again, the Facebooks, the TikToks of the world. The advantage here is that you get explicit consent, and the users can control the data that you have access to, and they can rescind access if they want to. So it's more powerful in that way. It's also more reliable than just have people put in their information. The last thing, and this is how we usually get a lot of our background data, our data transparency services. Again, the focus here is digital services, but you can also go out into the real world and get buy data from other transparency systems. The voter data is a data transparency system that's just mostly physical or sometimes on CDs. But the idea here is, at least when you're online or dealing with online surveys, you can actually ask people to go export their data. They go to Facebook and export their data. In this case, you can go to Google, export your maps data, and that gives you somebody's location history. My location history, I think, goes back almost 15 years now. So you know where I've been every for the past 15 years, every day for the past 15 years, which is kind of wild. But I think one of the things that I like to point out here is that there's actually a lot of data that you can get because people just have it. These companies have it, they can get it from those companies. And they can give it to you for research. So how do you actually put these in your survey? So the first thing you do is manual input. So somebody can go download their Google data and then upload it to your Qualtrics survey or some sort of Drive folder. You don't caveat emptor in terms of data security. It's sort of up to you to make sure that you do the right thing for subject protection. Another thing that you can do is iframe embedding. So somebody's on a Qualtrics survey, and then you want to connect them to Twitter so that they can so that you can access the Twitter data or Facebook data. You can use an iframe to do that. The other thing that you can do, and this is what we've done on Volunteer Science, we do iframes and cross-domain services, but essentially we've built our service to be able to talk to Qualtrics, so that essentially they just click this little verify button, and that sends a request to Volunteer Science. It says, okay, so volunteer says, this person is requesting access to Facebook, our Facebook app. We show the person the authorization for Facebook, they authorize it, and then you as the researcher get to go download the person's data, the data that they authorize. Oh, sorry, Qualtrics. Qualtrics is a survey platform, one of the common survey creating platforms. The advantages to Qualtrics, and I think, Momentive, they're Momentive now, is that they allow for embedding JavaScript. So that allows iframes and these cross-domain services to work. Thank you. And Qualtrics and Momentive make it easy to create surveys. But of course, you can create your own. Iframes and these cross-domain services, they require JavaScript. So if you don't have the ability to run JavaScript in your survey, you can't do either one. I believe that's true. Iframes are actually HTML elements. You might be able to get a basic iframe working without JavaScript. Yes, Qualtrics is also very expensive, and there are other cheap platforms out there. So the advantage to having iframes be the way that you collect this data is that they're very customizable. They're very flexible. The way that it works is essentially it's a tunnel to a secondary web service like Volunteer Science. So somebody's on Qualtrics, they open up the iframe, they're still on Qualtrics, but then they can interact with something on the Volunteer Science website, for example. So all you then have to do is build whatever you want on Volunteer Science, and they can interact with it. So if it's uploading just a big JSON document or HTML document where they just copied and pasted a web page of their results, you can paste that into Volunteer Science and have a little parser that pulls all the information out that you need and saves it. So you don't have to try to build everything in Qualtrics. It's the great thing about iframes. The downside is they're pretty fragile. Iframes, a lot of companies don't like iframes for a number of reasons, and a lot of browsers don't like iframes. They're all allowed, but especially in-app browsers. So like if you've been on your mobile phone and you've been on Facebook and you've clicked a link, you don't actually go to like Chrome. That you don't go to that link in Chrome. You stay in Facebook. That's called an in-app browser. Those in-app browsers have very weird, undocumented rules, and Facebook builds it to work for Facebook to keep you on Facebook. So anyway, they can be fragile to those like weird edge cases. The other thing to mention is that iframes have to be enabled on the embedded service. So Volunteer Science, you can iframe all day, but you can't run Twitter as an iframe. So you can't have Qualtrics with an iframe to Twitter where people can see their own timeline, stuff like that. So it's not quite as robust. The other option, these cross-domain services, they are very robust. They work because they natively connect to the underlying services. They're reliable for that reason as well. And they're also secure, so you can control the information that gets shared from Qualtrics to Volunteer Science or between the two platforms. You're not worried about people like copying and pasting a bunch of stuff and trying to put it into the Qualtrics or trying to log into Facebook or authorize Facebook and then come back to the survey. All that stuff is handled sort of under the hood. Again, it can't work without JavaScript. This definitely cannot work without JavaScript enabled. So not all survey software may support it. I'm not 100% sure which systems support JavaScript, which ones don't. I don't know. RedCap is one of the usual suspects for medical research. I don't know if it supports JavaScript. The other thing is that you have to build a specific service for each platform. Like we have a Facebook app to collect Facebook data, and we have a Twitter app to collect Twitter data. So it takes more work to get these cross-domain services up and running. So we're going to talk about getting instrumented data. With instrumented data, it's really up to you to build the instrument. We have 4 examples here of this task, like a cognitive task. If you're in cognitive psychology, social psychology, you're very familiar with these cognitive tasks where you're getting people to respond quickly and simply to some stimuli. Another one is decisions. So, again, these bargaining decisions, like a prisoner's dilemma, they can also be you give people $100 and they have to allocate it to multiple causes, and you want to measure which cause do they give more money to. The last thing I'll just mention here is this simulated stimulus, where you create your own stimuli that you want people to respond to, like a vignette. And the idea here is that we're going to see how this simulated reality changes their behavior. And the last thing I mentioned, actually, as I should say, is interventions. This is where we want to try to change people's behavior. And so we want to build something where they're interacting with it or they're learning something from it. It's usually not a survey, but we want to try to do an intervention where people are learning something new or reflecting on their behavior or setting new goals. Typically, you're building something that's not a survey. So that's another type of instrument that you get a lot with behavioral data. Where do you get these tasks? So I think a lot of people start with surveys because surveys are really easy to do, just in terms of it's easy to ask people questions. It's hard to ask people good questions. It's hard to ask people the right questions, but it's easy to ask questions. It's really difficult unless you come from an experimental tradition to think about the tasks that you can get people to do and what kind of data you can get from tasks. Very often, I think people build their own stuff, and this is especially coming from a world of vignettes, where you want to get people to respond to vignettes. You're writing up a story. For those of you who are sort of getting into a field or getting into a domain of study where there are tasks, the best way to get started is actually look at specific papers and try to reproduce the tasks that they use. The challenge, one of the reasons we built volunteer science is because you can't read a paper and then build a task. There's usually just not enough information to replicate paper precisely. People don't publish their materials, but it's a place to start. So if you're thinking about how do I, try to elicit this group decision-making phenomenon, you look at the literature on it and see how people generally create tasks to do it, and then you build your own. Fortunately, increasingly, there are libraries where you can where people have already created these tasks. JSPsych and PsychoPy are the really common ones in cognitive psychology, doing these reaction time tasks. O3 is there for economic multi-person experiments. They're out there. So if you're in a discipline where there are established task frameworks and paradigms, increasingly now there are libraries that you can use to find tasks, especially ones that are pre-built. The last thing I'll mention is that we have a bunch of templates, a lot borrowed from the JSPsych world, a lot that we've created ourselves based on bargaining games, decision-making tasks, those kind of things. And again, this is where you are able to reuse something that's already there, which saves you tons of time, and it also helps locate your research in the literature. You're using studies that other people have already built on, done research with. So how do you integrate these tasks into surveys? So very often, you do this sequentially. So somebody goes to the Qualtrics survey, and then they go to volunteer science to do the task. or they start on volunteer science where they do the task and then they switch over to Qualtrics. This is usually pretty fine. You get a lot of drop off when people go from one platform to the other. You want to try to minimize the friction there. The other way to do this is this iframe embedding. Because you're creating tasks, and tasks can be whatever, there's no service that you can build here. The best thing that you can do is iframes. The big advantage to the iframes is that people don't leave their platform. So you can do an iframe, you can iframe Qualtrics within volunteer science, or you can iframe volunteer science within Qualtrics. It works both ways. Again, what this does is allows you to do the task and the survey without people leaving the website wherever they start. The last one I want to talk about is collecting data using instruments in the field. I think the hot one now, it's trendy, but it's also important. Or ecological momentary assessments. It's asking people how they're doing, what they're doing, asking them to do something within a given day and time. This can be randomly sampled or it can be regularly sampled. But this is this is getting the survey out into the field. So you get better measures using specific questions. The other thing that you can do are context-aware assessments. So in an online or offline context. So in online context, somebody's browsing a website and you say, hey, you're shopping for, oh, here we go. Hey, you're doing, I saw you did a Google search. Do you think these results are politically biased? Right. So maybe I'm studying political bias, the perceptions of political bias in ranking algorithms. So this context-aware assessments would be like, and I'll talk about this in a little bit more in a second, would be like a browser extension that sees, oh, I just did a Google search, or this person just did a Google search, let's trigger this survey. In an offline context, we can use, say, a mobile app to detect when somebody's at a certain location. Oh, you're at the grocery store, who's doing the shopping, or that's not a good one because obviously you're doing the shopping. It's not a good question. What are you buying? How healthy is the food, or how important is healthy food to you right now? That kind of sort of offline-based context-aware assessment. Another thing that you can do is prompt-driven measurement. So this is basically telling people to go do something. So one thing that we've done before is telling people to go do a Google search. We've done this as part of like algorithmic auditing. We have a browser extension, and we collect the Google results that you get to compare to other Google search results. And one of the things that we can do is we can say, okay, here's this new event that's happened in the world. We need you to do a Google search for it and see if you get different results. So you're pushing people to do something and to get data on what they do or what happens as a result of it. And the last thing about instruments in the field are these diaries, journals. It's asking people to fill in information as they go through their day, or at the end of the day, you want them to fill out some information about their that day. Again, this is about getting the survey as close to the behavior as possible. Yes, I do have a word puzzle. I actually just built word puzzle. Actually, I did a word scramble puzzle. I'm happy to talk about that offline, and I will follow up about that. But that's the point. That's actually one of the things with volunteer science. One of the big uses for us is like you build whatever you want, and then you can embed it in Qualtrics, or vice versa. So you don't have to be stuck with just doing something in Qualtrics. So getting back to this, how do you integrate these field measurements with surveys? It seems simple, right? You just want to get the survey out, but it's relatively complex. And this is why I want to spend a little time here talking about the components of making this work. So the first thing you have to have is a prompting system, which is getting people to do the survey when you need that survey done, and knowing when that survey has to be done, or knowing when that task or whatever measurement you want to capture needs to be done. So the first thing you have to have is a communication system that tells people that they need to do some task, give up some data. Push notifications are common, and they happen on mobile and browser. So that's one of the advantages of having a push notification system. SMS, very common, in part because usually you want people to be able to go from something on the device to a survey or to some task online, so they need to be able to click a link. They also need to be around. I almost had email in this list, and I realized that email actually is not synchronous. So people aren't like on their email all the time. So there's a delay when you send an email versus when people respond. Email does work if you need like a daily diary and you want to remind people every night, hey, don't forget, to fill in your diary. Emails can work there. The last thing is a phone call. So there are plenty of systems now for automating a message to people that just says, hey, don't forget to take this survey. But you have to think about your communication system. We have a system for doing SMS and push notifications in volunteer science. You can just sort of schedule it and forget it kind of thing. The next thing that you have to have, depending on the kind of study, is the context sensing system. So if you're doing this context-aware measurements, you have to have a mobile app or a browser extension. And this is just because we're using people's devices to figure out what the context is. You theoretically could use SMS messages to say, like, if you are at home, take the survey, and that sort of becomes your way of sensing the context. But generally, people are using mobile apps or browser extensions. The browser extension is there to sense what people are doing online, and the mobile app is there to sense either what they're doing on their phone or what they're doing in the real world, or the offline world, so I should say. Not hard to build a mobile app, not hard to build a browser extension, especially if you're doing something simple like collecting people's location data to figure out where they are, or collecting people's browsing information to know what site they're on. Don't let those things scare you. They're easy to do. Next thing, data collection. You have to think about how do people actually get from their phone or from their computer to your thing, to the tool that you're doing, the data that you want them to upload, the survey that you want them to respond to. This is relatively easy, but it's topic specific. And I'll talk a little bit about how to do this in a second. The last thing that can be really difficult is collation. So linking people across all of these activities. How do you make sure that the person who's responding to the survey is the person who filled out this original empanelment system? This is actually where a lot of trouble comes in because it's not easy. You have to force people to log in or verify that they are who they are so that you can link data. A couple of ways to do this. You can have a login system. You can have phone verification. So you send people an SMS message or an email verification. You send them an email. They click the link. They acknowledge the SMS, and then you're able to link them. The last thing you can do is have an identification code, like their email address, and just every time they come in, they just give you their email address, and you use that to, or some user ID information, and that's what you use to link them to their prior responses. But I will tell you now, collation is one of the hardest things to do, or one of the trickiest things is what I should say. It's not hard, it's just tricky. There are a lot of trade-offs. All right, so how do we do this? So one is a push to web. How do we bring this all together into a single study where we collect data from the field? So one is push to web. We send them text messages, or we send them browser notifications that says, hey, you need to come do this thing online. Another one is this mobile app. So they just have the study sitting in their pocket and they do it right there on their phone. Lastly, there's a browser extension. You can, with the mobile app and the browser extension, you can embed the survey in the app or in the extension, or you can send them sort of the push to web style, just to your Qualtrics link or your volunteer science task, and collect the data there. The mobile app makes it a little bit easier to do the collation because they have to be signed into the app to do the thing. And if you host the survey in the app, it's much easier to keep track of people. With the browser extension push to web, this is where you can really lose people if they don't give you the right information. You don't have a login system. You don't have a way of reliably linking people. All right, last pause. There we go. It's on the click. One of the concepts that you study and think about how to measure it using two of the methods that we talked about. This pass data collection, instrumented data collection. I should stop this because it's, that's great. I'll restart it. I can restart it. So take one of your concepts that you're measuring, and then how you would measure it using two of these types of behavioral data. And if you're really on the ball, think about how this works for your second concept that you study. Got it. Okay. If I double click, the timer just ends. People endorsements on social network surveys. Oh, that's a good one. I've been thinking about how to take social network surveys into this because it's a really good measurement. I keep forgetting that it's um, a form of data measurement. Just forget about it sometimes. All right, let's see. So with that, I want to go ahead and wrap things up. A couple of things, a couple of housekeeping notes. First, I have a poll for y'all. It's just about your interest in doing more webinars or attending more webinars. We do tours of volunteer science. If you want to see a tour of the platform, let me know. And lastly, if there is something that you want to talk to me about, whether it's just getting feedback on a research design or talking about how to do a specific kind of research project, collect some kind of data, I'm happy. My calendar is open. If you say yes to make sure, there we go. Say yes to any of this stuff. I will send you an email for the one-on-one, or I'll add you to our researcher newsletter, or I'll send you an invite to our next tour. The last thing I will say while you're doing that, just remind you that our last workshop for the spring is coming up at the end of April. It's going to be on incentivizing online participants. So we will talk about how much should you pay people, when should you pay people in a study, but we're also going to talk about, again, going back to this is a mile wide and an inch deep. We're also going to talk about motivations besides just payment. We're going to talk about non-monetary rewards. How do you give them? When do you give them? What kinds are available to you? And we're going to talk about gamification, which is a third reward system. We'll now talk about what that really means. And I should copy that URL. I can't type that URL into the thing. I'll send you the URL to register in the follow-up sort of thank you email where I'll send you the link to the recording of this as well as the slides. That way you don't have to worry about trying to type this in. And with that, I will hang around for a little while. We got done early, which is great. Give you some time back. If you have any questions, want to hang around and talk for a little bit, that's cool. We can hang out. I'm happy to talk in chat. I will go ahead and stop the recording so folks can feel free to